Hi, welcome to another video by Country Data Files. Another year has gone by. 2021 has been an interesting year. For instance, this October, a new Metroid game called Metroid Dread came out. Due to the hype for the new game, there has been more interest in the older games of the series. Metroid has been around since 1986 and is an iconic series. It has similarities with another series that started in 1986 called Castlevania. Metroid and Castlevania are two action-adventure series with some elements of platform games like Super Mario. They have similar gameplay, and some of their games are considered classics. Metroid is owned by Nintendo, although it's not as popular as some other Nintendo series such as Super Mario, Legend of Zelda, and Pokemon. Castlevania is owned by Konami, a video game and arcade game company known for Metal Gear and Frogger. Both Metroid and Castlevania each have a passionate fan base. Together, they define the subgenre of platform adventure games. Consequently, some platform adventure games are referred to as Metroidvanias, a term made by combining the names of the two series. In this video, we're going to be looking at the history of these two series and how they affected and were affected by the history of video games. Metroid and Castlevania had their first releases in 1986. The first Metroid game was released on August 6, 1986, and the first Castlevania game was released on September 16, 1986. Metroid was one of the first platform adventure games in the third generation of video game consoles. It came out on the Famicom Family Computer, which was the name of the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. It wasn't released in the US on the Nintendo Entertainment System until August 15th the next year. Metroid was praised for its controls, graphics, soundtrack, and gameplay. It had the player explore 5 locations on the planet Zebes. The gameplay is similar to Super Mario, with 2D side-scrolling gameplay and power-ups such as the ability to morph into a ball. However, it was more about exploring, like Nintendo's other action-adventure series, The Legend of Zelda. The storyline is about a bounty hunter named Samus Aran, who sabotages an operation of space pirates that stole dangerous energy-sucking jellyfish parasites called Metroids from the Galactic Federation and is trying to weaponize them. As the player explores the world of Zebes, the player gains new abilities like the Screw Attack ability that lets you somersault to attack enemies, and the ability to freeze enemies with an ice beam. You can find external tanks that give Samus more health and missile packs that let you carry more missiles. With your new abilities, you can find secret passages and reach sections that you couldn't when you started the game. This has become a staple of Metroidvania games since then. The player has to defeat Ridley and Kraid, 2 powerful space pirates that are bosses, and when you defeat them both, you can enter a section you couldn't at the beginning and face off against an AI called Mother Brain that's behind the space pirates operation. After defeating Mother Brain, Samus escapes, and depending on how quickly the player beat the game, Samus takes her helmet off and is revealed to be a woman. If the player beats the game quickly enough, she is seen in a leotard or lingerie. This makes Metroid one of the first games to have a female protagonist. Metroid became a well-known game on the Nintendo console and is still speedran and re-released to this day. Because the Nintendo Entertainment System was the most popular console at the time, some third-party developers started making games for it, such as Konami, which created several, including Contra and Gradius. In 1987, they released the first Castlevania game. It has since become a classic. In Japan, it was known as Akumajo Dracula. It featured a legendary monster hunter named Simon Belmont, who fought monsters in Count Dracula's castle after he rose again. The game was extremely difficult, but became a classic, and there have been many sequels and prequels over the last 35 years. The gameplay featured many classic movie monsters that Simon Belmont had to defeat with his legendary whip known as Vampire Killer. It was split into 6 stages where Simon Belmont fought Medusa, Frankenstein, and ultimately the Grim Reaper, who are the bosses in the game's stages. After beating Death himself, Simon Belmont has to beat Count Dracula, which is extremely difficult. In the game's storyline, Simon Belmont belonged to the Belmont clan, a clan that passes down their powerful whip. When Dracula rises every 100 years, they kill him, but he keeps coming back. This was the start of one of the best-selling series by Konami. This series received 4 installments in the 3rd generation of consoles. A version called Vampire Killer was released for a retro computer that October, while an arcade game called Haunted Castle was released in 1987. But 2 more Castlevania installments were released on the Nintendo Entertainment System over the next few years. A sequel called Castlevania II Simon's Quest was released in 1987, while a prequel, Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, was released in 1989. Castlevania II Simon's Quest featured Simon Belmont searching 5 castles for some of Dracula's body parts. He needed them to break a curse Dracula put on him at the end of the first game. The gameplay was less linear than the first one, as it had Simon Belmont travel through an interconnected world where he could buy supplies from villagers and solve puzzles needed to reach the 5 castles. Also, for the first time, the player had an interface where they could see what items they have. This gave it some platform adventure and RPG elements, which would carry over to future Castlevania games. It had many new items the player had to find, which would be used to become more powerful and find objects that are needed to progress. Unlike the first game, there are only 3 boss battles: Carmelia, the Grim Reaper, and the reformed Count Dracula. The boss battles were much easier than the boss battles in the other 2 Nintendo games, and it was the first Castlevania game to have multiple different endings. Like in Metroid, if you beat the game fast enough, you get a better ending. It was one of the first games to have a day and night cycle, which is common in RPG games and is way more common nowadays than it was back then. If the player beat it in under 7 cycles, then Simon Belmont would survive his encounter at the end of the game. The platform adventure gameplay was inspired by another Konami game called The Maze of Gallius Nightmare 2. Castlevania III Dracula's Curse in 1989 was the final Castlevania game released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was a prequel to the first game, focusing on Trevor Belmont, one of Simon's ancestors, who became the first Belmont to defeat Count Dracula. This game reverted to the action platformer style of the first game and featured the same difficulty level. Several times in the game, the player has to choose what paths to take, which lead to different levels and unlock different characters. It introduced 3 new characters: Alucard, Dracula's half-breed son, a thief named Grant, and a witch named Sypha. Alucard could shoot fireballs and shapeshift into a bat, Grant was extremely fast and agile, and Sypha could perform multiple spells. The player would have to choose between them and could switch characters with their choice throughout the game. The stages were even harder than the first game, and there were more of them. The bosses were still very difficult, as both Dracula and the Grim Reaper returned. Dracula's Curse was a staple for the series, and the series wasn't done yet, as several more games would be made over the next few years. The next console that would have Metroid and Castlevania games was the Game Boy handheld. Since it was the first major handheld game console, it was black and white, and gameplay was very limited due to the device's capabilities. Nintendo made a sequel to Metroid on this console and called it Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Fortunately, the Game Boy Color allowed limited pixel coloring for the game's hardware. This game was more linear than the first Metroid game because of the limited capabilities of the system. The player knew the amount of Metroids alive from the beginning, and as the player destroyed them, new areas would become accessible. The storyline had Samus being sent on a mission to wipe out the Metroid species on their home planet of SR-388. Samus discovers that the Metroids she had fought in the first game were just infants, and the adults are powerful enemies. She destroys all of them and the Queen, but spares a hatchling and takes it back to the Federation to study. It was the first Metroid game to include save stations where the player can save the game, and it introduced Samus Aran's gunship. While Nintendo only made one Metroid game on the Game Boy, Konami made 4 Castlevania games. The Castlevania games on the console were Castlevania the Adventure and a sequel called Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge. They were both black and white. However, Konami released some game collections on the Game Boy Color a few years later. They included Castlevania the Adventure and its sequel in color. Castlevania the Adventure and its sequel featured the previous Belmont clan member named Christopher Belmont going up against Count Dracula. These games had several new bosses and levels, although the Grim Reaper did not return. The heart pickups were different in this game, as they would restore the player's health rather than make them more powerful. The second one was about Christopher Belmont freeing his son from Count Dracula. The level design was similar to Mega Man, where the player could select what stages they wanted to do in whatever order they wanted to, and then at the end of the game there would be several stages in a specific order. A third Castlevania game on the console, called Castlevania Legends, featuring a female Belmont named Sonia Belmont, was made. It wasn't released until 1997, after several more years of console games came out. Although it's non-canon, it was supposedly set before the other games and featured branching paths. You collect objects as you explore the map, and it has a menu. However, like Castlevania II Simon's Quest, health bars of bosses are removed. Another non-canon spin-off called Kid Dracula was released. The main character is Dracula's young son, which makes him an alternative version of Alucard. In the 4th generation of video game consoles, Konami released several more Castlevania games. The TurboGrafx-16, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo each had a Castlevania game. The Super Nintendo had a non-canon alternative version of the original about Simon Belmont fighting the dark forces of Dracula across many levels. It was called Super Castlevania 4. This time, the player could swing Simon Belmont's whip in multiple directions. This game made use of the new hardware in the Super Nintendo, as the player could swing across rings, and the backgrounds and environments were more advanced. It introduced a lot of new enemies that would return in the future. There are a lot of levels outside of Dracula's castle before, and a few more inside it. The Grim Reaper, Medusa, and Frankenstein returned. On the TurboGrafx-16 PC Engine CD, Konami released another Castlevania game called Rondo of Blood in 1993. It featured a new Belmont named Richter Belmont, a descendant of Simon Belmont, who would once again fight Dracula, who kidnapped his girlfriend, Annetta, and is threatening to sire her. This was the first Castlevania game to include anime cutscenes. Rondo of Blood allowed the player to play as a girl named Maria later on. In 1995, a separate version of Rondo of Blood was released on the Super Nintendo. It was called Dracula X. It had different levels and was far more difficult than the original. However, this alternate version is non-canon. Rondo of Blood was eventually re-released on other consoles, such as the PlayStation Portable, in the years to come. On the Sega Genesis, Konami released another Castlevania game called Castlevania Bloodlines. It had 6 stages and featured 2 main characters to choose from, John Morris and Eric Lacarde. John Morris is the son of Quincy Morris, a side character from Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel. John Morris uses the vampire killer whip, while Eric Lacarde uses Alucard's spear. The plot focuses on Dracula's niece, Elizabeth Bartley, trying to revive her uncle. The game was set in 1917 Europe, so it had some steampunk elements such as mechanical monsters. It had multiple different endings. It also replaced the usual hearts collected while playing the game with red jewels. While Konami made many Castlevania games in the 4th generation, Nintendo only made one Metroid game. Super Metroid was a sequel to Metroid 2 that had Samus returning to planet Zebes to retrieve the infant Metroid that was kidnapped by her archenemy, Ridley. The planet of Zebes is swarming with space pirates, and the player must explore the 6 regions for power-ups before finally reaching the final boss in Torian. This game introduces an auto-scrolling map that the player must download sections from map stations. Because of this, the player can see where they are and must explore every section of the map. The game encourages the player to explore every section, and they will find power-ups, extra health, and ammo extensions as they go. This game is a classic, and speedruns of it are popular. However, this was the last Metroid game for a long time. Although no Metroid games were made in the 5th generation, Nintendo included Samus Aran as one of the characters in Super Smash Bros., one of the most popular games on the console. It was a crossover fighting game where characters from many different Nintendo series such as The Legend of Zelda, Kirby, and Super Mario. This introduced Samus to a lot of gamers that had never played the Metroid series. Nintendo considered making a Metroid game on the console, but it never entered production. Because of this, we didn't get a 3D Metroid game until the 6th generation of consoles several years later. Meanwhile, on the Nintendo 64 console, a British game developer called Rare had a partnership with Nintendo. They created a game that was heavily inspired by Metroid. They're known for the classic GoldenEye 007 game and a platformer called Banjo-Kazooie. They made an action-adventure third-person shooter game called Jet Force Gemini. It was very similar to the Metroid series and was inspired by it, with the player fighting alien bugs and exploring vast science fiction locations. While Nintendo didn't make any Metroid games on the Nintendo 64, Konami made 4 Castlevania games, 2 on the N64, and 2 PlayStation games. First of all, there was Castlevania Chronicles, a remake of the original Castlevania game with Simon Belmont. It was released on a Japanese home computer in 1993, and a PlayStation port came out in 2001. We got a PlayStation 1 Castlevania game called Symphony of the Night in 1997. The next year, it was ported to the Sega Saturn in Japan. Additionally, we got a Nintendo 64 game that was the first 3D Castlevania game, and it had an expanded version called Legacy of Darkness. Secondly, on the PlayStation, Konami released Castlevania Symphony of the Night, known as Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight in Japan. Symphony of the Night moved on from the recent platform games and reintroduced non-linear levels and exploration from Castlevania II's Simon's Quest. Like some RPG games, the player would gain experience points from defeating monsters and would level up over time. The player could decide what weapons and equipment to use with an interface. This game was inspired by Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series, which had non-linear action-adventure gameplay and exploration. Legend of Zelda had a mini-map showing where the player could go in dungeons, so this was recycled for the action RPG platform adventure game of Symphony of the Night. Their finished project was very similar to the map in Super Metroid. This time, Dracula's castle was open-ended, and the player had to traverse each of the 14 sections of the castle. The player needs to fill up every section of the map and discover many secrets, spells, and items. Symphony of the Night was a direct sequel of Dracula X Rondo of Blood. The game starts with Richter Belmont defeating Dracula, which was the final boss in Dracula X. Symphony of the Night had multiple different endings depending on the player's decisions. Symphony of the Night made a lot of money, and most people liked the gameplay style, which inspired many Metroidvanias in the future. The Game Boy Advance and DS Castlevania games in the next century would adopt its style. Because of this, Castlevania games have some similarities to Metroid, and some platform adventure games featuring an open-ended world, exploration, and the use of power-ups to access sections you couldn't previously reach are called Metroidvanias. Castlevania games of this style resemble fantasy RPGs, such as Dungeons and Dragons. For instance, a lot of monsters are extremely similar to Dungeons and Dragons. Castlevania Symphony of the Night was much easier than the previous platform games. Lastly, Konami released 2 Castlevania games on the Nintendo 64 in 1999. They were 3D and followed the traditional platform gameplay of the original games rather than the Metroidvania action-adventure style. For instance, they were split into stages instead of having an open-ended, non-linear world. The gameplay was similar to the Legend of Zelda games on the Nintendo 64, but the player could jump and swing a whip like the 2D Castlevania games. Like the 2D games, it has sub-weapons, but hearts are replaced with red jewels identical to the Bloodline Sega Genesis game. The player could choose between Reinhardt Snyder, a man who wields the vampire killer whip, and a young girl named Carrie Ferdinez. It received a lot of criticism for its camera controls. An expanded version released that year contained more levels, new characters, and cutscenes. One of the main characters was Cornell, a man-beast capable of turning into a werewolf. The beginning of Legacy of Darkness was set in 1844, while the events of the regular game are set in 1852. However, both of these games are non-canon, so it does not relate to the timeline of the main series. This was the end of the 5th generation of gaming, but Metroid returned in the next generation, and both series made games on the Game Boy Advance. Castlevania was the first to release a game on the new platform. With the new Metroidvania style, 3 action RPG platform adventure games were made. The first one was Circle of the Moon, released in 2001. Circle of the Moon featured a new character named Nathan Graves whipping his way through Dracula's castle with the Belmont clan's whip. This was the first Metroidvania-style Castlevania game where the main character used the iconic vampire killer whip. The player would get several new abilities as they play through, such as the ability to run, double jump, and wall kick, which you would need to reach new areas. Like Symphony of the Night, it had hit points, and the player would level up as he went. The plot for this game was centered around a female vampire named Kamala resurrecting Dracula in her castle. It was set in 1830, but is non-canon. The graphics were a little darker than the rest of the series, and there were 14 sections in the castle, and the map was intriguing to explore. Harmony of Dissonance was the second Castlevania game released on the GBA. It was set in between Simon's Quest and Rondo of Blood, where Simon Belmont's grandson, Justy Belmont, was the main character. This game had 2 different castles that are nearly identical, like in Symphony of the Night. The player has to find spellbooks and relics as they play along. Plus, the Belmont clan's whip can become more powerful with some of the power-ups found during the game. It has 3 separate endings depending on the player's decisions. The last Castlevania game released on the GBA was Aria of Sorrow. Aria of Sorrow is not set in the past like the other Castlevania games, and is instead set in the near future of 2035. Unlike most other Castlevania games, Dracula is not the final boss, because in the universe of Castlevania, Dracula is destroyed once and for all in 1999 by the Belmont clan's last living descendant, Julius Belmont. After beating the game as Soma Cruz, you can play a special mode where Julius Belmont is the main character. The main playable character is a high school student named Soma Cruz, studying Japan, who enters the castle, which is swarming with monsters awaiting the return of Dracula's successor. Soma Cruz discovers that he has the dark magic ability to absorb the souls and use the powers of the monsters he kills. This new game mechanic gives the player a lot of new abilities. Additionally, sub-weapons from the rest of the series no longer exist. Like Alucard in Symphony of the Night, Soma Cruz finds weapons to use during the game rather than relying on one weapon like the Belmonts. In the end, there's a plot twist that Soma Cruz is actually Count Dracula reincarnated. During the GBA era, Nintendo made 2 Metroid games on it. For instance, a 4th Metroid game called Metroid Fusion came out. Fusion has similar gameplay to Super Metroid, with Samus exploring a research station overrun by alien parasites. Unlike the previous games, Samus follows orders by a computer called Atom that told the player where to go and what to do. This made the game much more linear, which not all fans liked. The storyline focused on Samus barely surviving an encounter with an X-parasite, a parasite that reproduces at a rapid rate, enters cracks and crevices easily, kills the host, and can copy them later on. The parasite cloned her and stalked her as she traveled around a research station overran by them. Fortunately, after her encounter, she becomes immune due to a vaccine created using Metroid cells. It made her unable to use her ice beams because Metroids are vulnerable to the cold, and gave her the ability to heal herself by absorbing the X-parasites, because Metroids were a predator of the X-parasites. However, if you fail to capture the X-parasite after destroying the host, it will reform stronger. Metroid Fusion uses some software from Wario Land 4, a popular platform game released on the Nintendo GBA right before Metroid Fusion. Another game released on the GBA was Zero Mission, a remake of the original Metroid game with a mini-map and game engine similar to Fusion. Despite being a remake, it has a lot of changes. There are a bunch of new sections on the map, lots of new enemies, and even some new boss battles. According to Nintendo, it's canon and takes the original's place on the timeline. With the beginning of the 2000s, a new generation of game consoles began. Both Nintendo and Konami released Metroid and Castlevania games during this time. Shooter and hack-and-slash games had become popular, so Nintendo and Konami added hack-and-slash and shooter elements to their games. Metroid was the first to release a game in the 6th generation of consoles. Nintendo never made a Metroid game on the Nintendo 64, so the first 3D Metroid game came out on the GameCube. In 2002, Nintendo released Metroid Prime. It was made by Retro Studios, a subsidiary of Nintendo based in Texas. Metroid Prime was 3D, but it was in first person rather than third person. This allowed the user to see the game from Samus's point of view. However, it didn't lose its exploration and action-adventure elements, as it was a first-person adventure rather than a first-person shooter. Metroid Prime had Samus investigate a space pirate warship to find a robotic form of Ridley. She barely escapes and loses most of her powers, so she has to regain them during the game and chases Ridley to planet Talon 4. While on Talon, Samus finds ruins of aliens called Chozo and encounters a creature called Metroid Prime. The gameplay had Samus exploring 6 locations in Talon, each with different biomes. Metroid Prime had a sequel released in 2004 called Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. In this game, Samus travels to a rogue planet called Ether that's threatened by violent storms. She enters 5 new locations and an alternate dimension. While doing so, she has to fight off Dark Samus. While Metroid transitioned to 3D, Konami tried to make a game for the Sega Dreamcast. It was going to be called Castlevania Resurrections, and would feature Sonia Belmont from Castlevania Legends. However, it was cancelled when the PlayStation 2 was announced. Konami made 2 3D Castlevania games on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. These games had a strong emphasis on fighting with melee weapons and were very violent and dark, leading to all Castlevania games from this point to be rated M. They had hack-and-slash elements and inspiration from God of War, a popular hack-and-slash game on the PlayStation 2. Lament of Innocence was the first one released in 2003. It featured some RPG elements and backtracking and upgrades similar to the Metroidvania-style games on the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance. It is chronologically the first game in the Castlevania fictional timeline. The main character is Leon Belmont, the first member of the Belmont clan. It is set during the High Middle Ages in 1072, which is before the rest of the series. The gameplay includes an in-game map similar to the other Castlevania and Legend of Zelda games. The second game released was Curse of Darkness in 2005. It came out on the Xbox and PlayStation 2. It was set a few years after Castlevania III Dracula's Curse and focused on a rogue servant of Dracula named Hector. The gameplay was very similar to Lament of Innocence. However, because Hector isn't a Belmont, he can choose what weapons to use after he finds them in a castle, like Alucard and Soma Cruz from the 2D games. Konami wasn't finished yet, as they made several Castlevania games on Nintendo's 7th generation handheld, the DS. The dual screen allowed Metroidvania minimaps to be displayed on a separate screen so the player wouldn't have to constantly pause the game to see it. Castlevania took advantage of this. The first Castlevania game released on the DS was a direct sequel to Aria of Sorrow. It was called Dawn of Sorrow. Soma Cruz was the main character, and he had the same ability. However, this game features enhanced graphics and a different castle. The main villain is Celia Fortner, a woman trying to find a new Dark Lord. They attack Soma and his friend, who follow them to their base. Portrait of Ruin was the next Castlevania game released on the DS. It's different than the rest of the series because the player plays as two characters at once and has to switch between them to solve puzzles and fight enemies. The main character is Jonathan Morris, the son of John Morris from Castlevania Bloodlines. His friend, Charlotte Allen, a young sorceress, is the other playable character. The players travel through magic portraits that teleport the player to other areas. This is similar to the portraits in Super Mario 64. The last Castlevania game released on the DS was Order of Ecclesia. It continued the platform adventure style of Castlevania games, but the stages were broken up and accessible on a world map. It was about an organization called Ecclesia that hunted Dracula after the Belmont clan disappeared in the 1800s. The main character is Shinoa, a woman working for the Order. She has to fight her stepbrother named Albus that had gone rogue. She relies on magical glyphs to attack enemies. The gaming community liked the main character Shinoa, saying that she's attractive but not too over-sexualized. These games were on the Nintendo DS. However, on the PlayStation Portable, one other Castlevania game was made. It was called The Dracula X Chronicles. It was a remake of Rondo of Blood with better graphics and 2.5D gameplay. In the 7th generation of handhelds, Nintendo released 2 Metroid Prime games on the DS. However, they didn't make any 2D ones. At first, they intended to make one called Metroid Dread, however, the project never saw the light of day. Nintendo made a pinball game on the handheld and called it Metroid Prime Pinball. In this game, the player played as Samus's Morph Ball form and scored points on many different levels themed after the Metroid Prime games. Making pinball spin-offs has been done before by Nintendo. For instance, Super Mario and Pokemon pinball games have been made in the past. But this wasn't the only Metroid game on the DS, as a first-person action-adventure game called Metroid Prime Hunters was released on the DS. It was 3D and had gameplay similar to the GameCube games. It's set in between Metroid Prime and its sequel, Metroid Prime Echoes. In this game, the player has to fight several other space bounty hunters. The gameplay is much more linear and focuses more on shooting than exploration. But there are still some platform and exploration aspects. For instance, the player would still have to find power-ups, which would be used as weapons, but the player can travel to multiple different planets and gets to use the gunship more than in the previous games. It also had a multiplayer mode, so players could battle against each other through the internet. Meanwhile, on the consoles of the 7th generation, Nintendo made the Wii, while Sony and Microsoft made the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Nintendo released a third Metroid Prime game on the Wii called Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. Like in Metroid Prime Hunters, Samus would travel to multiple different planets and talk to other bounty hunters. Dark Samus returns as the main antagonist and is finally destroyed for good. This game frequently uses the motion controls of the Wii console. Nintendo released the first two Metroid Prime games on the Wii in a compilation called Metroid Prime Trilogy, which the controls are similar to Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. One last Metroid game was released on the Wii in 2010. It was called Metroid Other M. It was 3D, but unlike the Metroid Prime Trilogy, it was in third-person perspective, except for when the player is shooting. Samus is faster than in the Prime games, and this game was set between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. It also introduced the melee attacks for close-range fighting. The gameplay has Samus explore a bottle ship. However, like Metroid Fusion, Samus followed the orders of Adam, and this game was far more linear than the rest of the series. Plus, the plot, character development, and voice acting was criticized. Meanwhile, in the 7th generation, Konami released some Castlevania games. However, as of 2022, this is the last generation Konami made a new Castlevania game on home consoles. A fighting game was released on the Wii called Castlevania Judgment. It's non-canon, but it has characters from the entire series fighting each other. It got a hard time for its controls and camera. However, it made use of the Wii controller, and the characters could use sub-weapons during combat. On WiiWare, Konami released a remake of Castlevania The Adventure from the Game Boy. It was called Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. Castlevania is not the only Konami series to get a WiiWare game, as Gradius and Contra also had WiiWare remakes. In the 2010s, Castlevania was rebooted. Konami made 3 games in a series called Castlevania Lords of Shadow. It was a 3D action-adventure hack-and-slash series made by a company called Mercury Steam. It has ports for both the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows. Like the original series, it's split into levels rather than following the Metroidvania style. The hack-and-slash elements were very similar to God of War, and this game was very dark like the PS2 and Xbox games. The storyline was set during the Middle Ages, and is in an alternate universe from the rest of the series. The player is Gabrielle Belmont. In the end, there's a twist that Gabrielle Belmont became Dracula after stealing power from an ancient demon called the Forgotten One. Mercury Steam made another game called Mirror of Fate on the 3DS, Nintendo's 8th generation video game handheld, which makes this the only new Castlevania game in the 8th generation. It was a side-scroller similar to the 90s Castlevania games, but it included a mini-map similar to the Metroidvania-style games. For the first time since Super Castlevania 4, the character could swing a whip in multiple directions in a 2D game. In 2014, another sequel was released called Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. It had an open world. This was the last Castlevania game. Secondly, there's a popular anime series on Netflix that ran from 2017 to 2021. Castlevania's most well-known producer, Koji Igarashi, left the company in 2014 and started a new company called ArtPlay. ArtPlay made a retro-style series similar to Castlevania called Bloodstained. It consisted of Bloodstained Curse of the Moon and its sequel Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2, which had gameplay similar to the Nintendo Castlevania games. They also made a Metroidvania game called Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which gameplay is very similar to Symphony of the Night. The main character, Miram, is similar to Soma Cruz and Shinoa from Castlevania. Meanwhile, Metroid had a bit of a hiatus during the beginning of the 8th generation of video game consoles, but there was a revival later on. There were no Metroid games on Nintendo's 8th generation console, the Wii U. However, Samus appeared in Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U and 3DS. In 2012, a Wii U game called Nintendo Land had mini-games based on multiple Nintendo properties. Metroid managed to get a team attraction in this, where players wore suits similar to Samus and traveled across multiple areas in an action-adventure game. Ridley, Kraid, and Metroids appeared in this attraction. Eventually, on the 3DS, 2 Metroid games were made. A spin-off of Metroid Prime called Metroid Prime Federation Force was developed by Next Generation Studios working with Nintendo. They also worked with Nintendo to make a sequel to Luigi's Mansion on the 3DS and later Nintendo Switch. Federation Force was a multiplayer first-person shooter and as of now is the only Metroid game where Samus isn't playable. The players are the Federation Force Marines who travel across 3 planets in the Bermuda system. It's set between Metroid Prime 3 and Metroid 2 Return of Samus. Speaking of Metroid 2, on the 3DS, Nintendo published a remake of Metroid 2 called Metroid Samus Returns. It's a platform adventure game made by Nintendo EPD with the help of Mercury Steam, the developer that helped make the Castlevania Lords of Shadow series with Konami. Samus Returns was 2.5D, a word for 2D games that appear to be 3D. The stages and plot are similar to the original Game Boy game, but it adds Ridley as the final boss. This is the first time Ridley appears as the final boss. It also adds new cutscenes and melee attacks similar to Metroid Other M. It has a mini-map similar to the other games in the series, and Castlevania Mirror of Fate. Like Castlevania and other Metroidvania games on the DS and 3DS, the player can see the mini-map on the 3DS's separate screen. Mercury Steam modified the classic Metroid gameplay so that Samus can point her arm cannon in any direction. Nintendo was impressed with this, so Nintendo partnered with Mercury Steam again for a 2D game on the Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch had a new Super Smash Bros. Game released in 2018 that included Dark Samus from Metroid Prime and Ridley. In 2017, Nintendo announced that a 4th Metroid Prime game would be released on the Nintendo Switch. In 2019, Retro Studios restarted its development. It will probably be several more years before it comes out. Fortunately, in October 2021, a new Metroid game was released. It was the first new 2D Metroid game since Metroid Fusion in 2002. It was developed by Mercury Steam and Nintendo EPD. It was called Metroid Dread because it's a revival of a cancelled DS game. This makes it chronologically the last Metroid game in the timeline, as it's set after Metroid Fusion, which until the release of Metroid Dread was set after the rest of the series. The game features Samus in a new suit, and the controls are similar to Samus Returns, a 3DS game. Although Adam returns, he doesn't boss Samus around like he did in Metroid Fusion and Other M. The player explores Planet ZDR freely and has to fight X-Parasites and ME robots. Many times the player is trapped in certain areas and has to find upgrades to escape. There are a lot of puzzles where the player has to understand a game mechanic called speed boosters and shine sparks to find items. The player discovers some secrets of the Chozo aliens. For the first time, there is a Chozo villain as the final boss. Also, Kraid from Super Metroid returns as a boss. So when will Metroid Prime 4 be released? What's in store for the future of the franchise? Only time will tell. I'm going to speculate that Metroid Prime 4 will be released at the end of the Nintendo Switch's lifespan, and it will be released on both the Nintendo Switch and Nintendo's next console succeeding it, similar to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and the Twilight Princess. So this is the story of the 2 series, and how they defined the Metroidvania subgenre. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.